Hello, I'm Peter Miller. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Before we begin, I want you to fully inhabit your own safety. Feel the warmth that cradles you, the simple comfort of a breath taken without struggle. That quiet miracle would have been a profound dream for most people throughout history. Tonight, I'll guide you back to a time when that warmth was not a given, but a hard-won achievement. This isn't a story told to frighten, but to frame our present peace. There is a profound solace in understanding the struggles of the past, a deep gratitude that settles into the bones. So, breathe. Notice the air on your skin, the solid support beneath you. This is your anchor. No matter where our story goes, you remain here, safe and warm. I'll be with you, walking back through time while firmly tethered to this moment. We drift back past centuries of progress to a world lit only by fire, to the medieval winter, not merely a season, but an annual question of survival. And please, carry this with you. The people we meet were not simple. They were humans, full of love, worry, and wit, born into a world without our advantages. Their intelligence was of a different kind, a deep, forgotten wisdom born of necessity. So let us walk back with respect and an open heart. What they knew, we have forgotten. And perhaps, in remembering, we find something essential for our own souls. Now, let's begin. A medieval winter was no romantic scene from a Christmas card. It was a vast, damp, and frozen blanket smothering the continent for months on end. It stole warmth, it stole harvest, and ultimately, it stole life. That cold was a patient predator. In the Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century and lasted into the 19th, winters grew even harsher. Rivers that had never frozen solid in living memory became highways of ice. The Thames in London froze so thick that people held frost fairs on its surface. Crops failed, livestock died, and in the small villages scattered across Europe, in the cottages and huts where peasant families lived, the question was not whether you would be comfortable. The question was whether you would live. And here is what strikes me most when I think about the people who lived through those winters. They did not have access to anything we would recognize as a store. There was no Home Depot where you could buy insulation, no online marketplace where you could order firewood, no way to simply purchase your way out of danger. The only materials available to them were the ones they could find within walking distance of their homes. Mud from the riverbank, straw from the threshed grain, sticks from the forest floor, animal dung from the barn. And from these humble materials that cost nothing, materials that most of us today would consider garbage, they built structures that could hold warmth through months of freezing darkness. Let me tell you about a wall. Not just any wall. A wall made of wattle and daub. To us, those words might sound quaint, almost primitive, old-fashioned, something from a fairy tale. But when you understand what they mean, you begin to see the genius hidden in simplicity. The process began in autumn. The season was crucial. After the harvest, when the wheat had been gathered and threshed, when the fields lay bare under the shortening days, families would turn their attention to the house, to making sure it could withstand what was coming. They would walk to the edges of their land, to the places where hazel or willow trees grew wild along streams and at the boundaries of fields. And they would cut thin, flexible branches, green wood, still alive, still bendable. Not the thick, straight timbers that would be used for the frame of a house. Those had been set in place years before. No, these were the filling, the weaving, the bones of the wall. They would bring these branches home, bundles of them, thin as your thumb or thinner. And then came the weaving. You have to imagine the rhythm of it, the repetition, the same motion over and over and over, hour after hour, day after day. A father and his grown son working side by side, or a mother and her daughters, sliding a branch through the vertical posts that form the skeleton of the wall, over, under, like basket weaving, but on the scale of a house, creating a lattice, a skeleton of wood that would become the bones of a wall. I've tried to imagine what it felt like. The green wood flexible in your hands, the smell of it, that clean scent of fresh cut willow, the ache in your back from bending, the calluses on your palms, the satisfaction of watching the wall take shape row by row, until what had been empty space between posts became a tight weave of wood. It was meditative work, mindless in the best way, the kind of work that lets your thoughts wander while your hands stay busy. But bones alone do not keep out the cold. The lattice of woven sticks had gaps. Wind could blow through, rain could pass between. So they made daub. And this is where the real magic happened. In a large pit near the house, dug into the earth, they mixed their materials. Earth, clay from the riverbank, if they were lucky enough to have clay on their land. Heavy, dense clay that would pack tight and dry hard. But clay alone was too brittle. It would crack as it dried, creating gaps that would let in cold and damp. So they added straw, the leftover straw from the threshed grain. Not the good grain itself, that was far too valuable, but the stalks, the stems, the parts that couldn't be eaten. This straw, chopped into short lengths, acted like tiny reinforcing bars, like the rebar we use in concrete today. The fibers ran through the clay in all directions, holding it together, preventing cracks from spreading. And then, something that might surprise you, something that sounds disgusting to our modern ears. Animal manure, usually from cows or horses. Fresh manure mixed right into the clay and straw. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone want to put animal waste into the walls of their home? But this was not about being primitive or unclean. The manure contained fibers, bits of undigested grass and grain that added even more reinforcement. It contained natural binding agents, substances produced in the animal's gut that made the mixture stick together better. And it contained microorganisms that, as they broke down the organic matter, actually helped the daub cure and harden properly. Once it dried, there was no smell. What remained was a substance as hard as concrete, but with a secret power. They would mix this daub with their feet. That's how it was done. Men, women, older children, all of them would step into the pit, and tread the mixture like you might tread grapes for wine, squishing it between their toes, feeling the clay and straw and manure combine into a thick, heavy mud. It was communal work. Everyone helped, and there was probably laughter, jokes about whose feet were dirtiest, children slipping and falling into the mud. It was hard work, but it was also life. It was what had to be done. Then came the application, taking handfuls of this daub mixture and packing it into the lattice of woven sticks, pressing it firmly into every gap, building it up layer by layer until the wall was thick. A foot thick, often, sometimes more. You would work from both sides of the wall, inside and outside, pressing the daub through the lattice until it met in the middle. Your hands would be covered in mud, your clothes splattered. By the end of the day, you would ache everywhere. But slowly, gap by gap, the wall would become solid. And here is what they understood, even without our modern science. This daub mixture, once packed thick into the lattice of woven sticks, created something remarkable. It created mass, thermal mass, as we call it now. During the day, when the weak winter sun touched the walls, or when the fire burned inside, these thick walls absorbed heat. Slowly, steadily, not like metal which heats up quickly and cools down quickly, but like stone, the clay and earth soaking up warmth like a sponge soaks water, storing it, holding it. And then, through the long night, when the fire had been banked low to conserve precious fuel, those walls gave the heat back. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in a slow, steady radiation that kept the interior space just warm enough. The walls became, in effect, a battery, a heat battery, charging during the day, discharging at night. The walls of a medieval peasant house were often a foot thick. I want you to really think about that. 12 inches of packed earth and straw and clay. Every inch of that thickness served a purpose. The straw trapped tiny pockets of air. And air, as modern science has proven, is one of the best insulators that exists. Still, air doesn't conduct heat well. So all those little pockets, thousands of them throughout the wall, acted as barriers to heat loss. The clay provided mass and moisture regulation. In winter, when the air inside became too dry from the fire, when it became harsh and hard to breathe, the walls would release moisture. They would actually give water vapor back into the air, making it easier to breathe, more comfortable for lungs that were already stressed by smoke and cold. In summer, they absorbed moisture, keeping the interior cool and dry. There's a term for this: hygroscopic material. Material that can absorb and release moisture in response to the environment. Modern buildings, with their drywall and paint and plastic vapor barriers, can't do this. They're sealed. They rely on mechanical ventilation to control humidity. But medieval walls breathed. They regulated themselves. I have stood inside buildings from this period that still exist. There aren't many left. Most have crumbled back into the earth they came from. But those that remain, carefully preserved, have a quality that's hard to describe. When you step inside, even on a cold day, the walls seem to embrace you. The temperature inside fluctuates far less than you would expect. Even when it's freezing outside, the interior maintains a kind of coolness that isn't hostile. It's neutral, calm, and when you place your hand against one of these old walls, it doesn't feel cold and dead like concrete or drywall. It feels almost alive, almost warm, even when it's not. There's a presence to it, a quality of mass and substance that modern walls don't have. But the walls were only half the equation. Above every medieval home sat another miracle of peasant engineering, the thatched roof. And when I say miracle, I mean it, because a good thatched roof, properly made, was more effective at keeping heat in than almost any roofing material we use today. When we think of thatched roofs today, if we think of them at all, we might picture them as charming, but impractical, quaint, a fire hazard certainly, something for tourist attractions and preserved historical buildings. But in medieval Europe, thatch was everywhere. From the poorest peasant's cottage to fairly substantial farmhouses, even some manor houses, thatch was the default roofing material. And for good reason. The material was free, completely free. After the grain harvest, every farming family had far more straw than they could possibly use for anything else. The grain itself, the seeds, would be stored for food and next year's planting. But the stalks, the stems, those were surplus. Some would be used for animal bedding. Some would be chopped up and mixed into daub. But the rest, the long, straight stalks of wheat or rye, or sometimes reeds cut from the edges of ponds, became the roof. But it was not simply thrown on top of the house in a messy pile. Thatching was an art, a craft, a skill that took years to master. There were professional thatchers who traveled from village to village, their services in high demand every autumn. But many families also learned to do basic thatching themselves, at least for repairs. The process began at the bottom edge of the roof and worked upward. The thatcher would take a bundle of straw, perhaps as thick around as your arm, and tie it tightly. Then this bundle would be laid along the bottom edge of the roof, attached to the wooden frame beneath, with withies, thin, flexible strips of willow or hazel that acted like rope. The next bundle would overlap the first, covering it by half. Then another bundle, overlapping again. Row after row, moving up the roof, each layer covering the one below. The layers built up, 6 inches thick, 8 inches, 10, 12. On the best houses, the thatch could be 18 inches deep or more. Think about what that means. 18 inches of densely packed straw, each hollow stem of straw containing a column of trapped air. Thousands upon thousands of these tiny air columns, stacked layer upon layer, overlapping in all directions. This created insulation that, in terms of its R value as we would measure it today, surpassed many modern materials. A thick, thatched roof could have an insulation value equivalent to 10 or 12 inches of fiberglass insulation. And it was made from what would otherwise be waste. But there was something else, something modern roofs can't do. The roof breathed. Unlike a modern roof of asphalt shingles or metal, which forms a complete vapor barrier, trapping moisture inside the house, a thatched roof allowed air to move through it slowly. This meant that moisture from cooking, from breathing, from the animals that were often kept inside during winter, from wet clothes drying by the fire, all of that moisture could escape gradually through the roof. This is actually one of the biggest problems with modern energy-efficient houses. We seal them so tight that moisture builds up inside. It condenses on cold windows. It grows mold in corners and closets. We have to install mechanical ventilation systems, fans that run constantly to prevent our houses from becoming damp and unhealthy. But a medieval thatched house naturally managed its own moisture. The thatch wicked it away, drew it up and out. The house stayed relatively dry despite having no mechanical systems at all. And there was a surprising side effect. In winter, when snow fell, it would settle onto these thatched roofs and stay there. On a modern metal or shingle roof, warmed by heat escaping from below, snow melts quickly. That's actually a sign of poor insulation. You can see which houses in a neighborhood have bad insulation by looking at whose roofs shed snow first. But on a well-thatched medieval roof, the insulation was so good that very little heat escaped through it. So the snow stayed frozen. It accumulated, and that layer of snow became an additional blanket of insulation. Nature itself was adding to the thermal protection. The more it snowed, the warmer the house became. The cold was insulating against itself. I find myself thinking about the patience required to build such a roof. The time, the skill. A full roof rethatching might take a week or more, even with multiple people working. And it couldn't be done alone. The physical difficulty of working on a sloped roof, handling bundles of straw, tying everything securely, all while balanced on ladders or standing on the partially completed roof itself, required many hands. So families would help each other. After harvest, as the days shortened and the first frosts appeared, the village would move from house to house. One week, the whole community would rethatch the Miller family's roof. The men working on the roof itself, the women preparing meals for the workers, the children running back and forth bringing bundles of straw, learning by watching. The next week, they would work on the bakers, then the smiths, then the carters, moving through the village, making sure every roof was sound before winter arrived in earnest. This was not charity. This was not kindness, though kindness was certainly part of it. This was survival, a cold, practical calculation. Everyone understood that if one family's roof failed during winter, that family would likely not survive. Children would die, adults would freeze, and a dead neighbor meant one less family to share labor with next year, one less household contributing to the village's work, the loss of knowledge and skill that had died with them. So, you helped your neighbor's roof, not just for their sake, but for your own. Because a strong village, where everyone's house was sound, was a village that could survive. There was a phrase they used. I came across it in a medieval document years ago, a manor court record from somewhere in Yorkshire. Raise the roof before the snow. It appeared in a judgment about a family that had neglected their thatching, and the court, the local lord's court that governed village affairs, had ordered the other villagers to help them, but also fined them for the neglect. Because a family that didn't maintain their roof was not just risking their own lives, they were risking the whole community. If their house became uninhabitable midwinter, they would need to be taken in somewhere else, burdening another household, or they would die, weakening the village. Raise the roof before the snow. It was both practical advice and a community motto. It meant that by working together, everyone's roof would be secure before the truly bitter weather arrived. It meant you didn't wait until the last minute. It meant you took responsibility. And it meant you helped others take responsibility because their survival was tied to yours. Now, let me tell you something that has stayed with me over all my years of studying this period. Something that fills me with a strange emotion I find hard to name. Awe, perhaps. Or maybe humility. The house I've just described, with its wattle-and-daub walls and its thick thatched roof, built entirely from materials that cost nothing, that was simply gathered from the local environment, could maintain an interior temperature significantly warmer than the outside air without any fire at all. Let me say that again, because it's important. Without any fire, without any external heat source. The thermal mass of the walls and the insulation of the roof were sufficient that, even when the outside temperature was below freezing, the inside would remain above freezing. Not warm by our standards, certainly. Perhaps 40 degrees Fahrenheit when it was 20 outside. But above freezing. Above the point where water turns to ice. Above the point where human tissue begins to die. And in a world where freezing meant death, above freezing meant life. That margin, those 20 degrees of difference created by nothing but mud and straw, was the difference between seeing spring and not seeing spring. Now, I need to pause here and share something personal with you. Something I've been thinking about more and more as I've gotten older. We, in the modern world, have lost something precious. We have gained so much. Climate control, comfort, freedom from the constant worry about fuel for heating, freedom from the fear of freezing. But we have lost the knowledge of how to be warm with nothing. We have lost the confidence that comes from knowing you can survive, truly survive, with only what the earth provides freely. I heat my house with a furnace. Like most of you, probably, I set a thermostat. Natural gas burns somewhere in my basement, and warm air flows through ducts, and my house stays at exactly 70 degrees, day and night, no matter what the weather does outside. It's convenient, it's comfortable, I'm grateful for it, but I also know, with a certainty that sometimes keeps me up at night, that if that system failed, I would be in trouble, real trouble. I don't know how to heat my house without it. Oh, I have some firewood, a fireplace that mostly just looks nice. But could I keep my family warm through a real winter, a medieval winter, with nothing but what I could gather? Honestly? No, I don't think I could. And that's a strange kind of poverty, isn't it? To be wealthy in so many ways. To have money and education and access to resources, but to lack the basic knowledge of survival. The medieval peasant was poor in ways we can barely imagine. They owned almost nothing, lived in a one-room house, worked from dawn to dusk just to have enough food. But they knew how to survive. They had skills embodied in their hands and minds that money couldn't buy. And if everything else failed, if some disaster struck, they could rebuild. They could start with nothing but earth and straw and make a shelter that would keep them alive. I'm not romanticizing their life. It was hard, brutally hard. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was short. Disease and hunger were constant threats. I wouldn't wish that life on anyone. But there was a competence there, a capability, a deep knowledge of materials and techniques and how the world works. And that knowledge was not written in books. It couldn't be Googled. It was passed down, father to son, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. It was in the hands, the way you wove the wattle, the angle at which you laid the thatch, the proportion of clay to straw to manure in the daub, the timing of when to gather materials and when to build. This was a literacy of survival, written in mud and straw instead of words. And it worked. It worked so well that some of these houses are still standing. Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon, built in the 16th century but using techniques from much earlier, is still there. Still has its original wattle and daub walls. Still has its timber frame. After 400 years, 4 centuries, how many modern houses will last 400 years? How many will still be standing, still be functional in the year 2400? I suspect very few. We build for 30 years, 50 if we're lucky. We use materials that are cheap to manufacture, but quick to decay. We rely on constant maintenance, constant replacement. But they built for generations, because they had to, because rebuilding was so difficult, so labor-intensive, that you built once and built well. There's a quiet lesson in that endurance, one that has nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with mindset. We live in a culture of the temporary, the upgrade, the disposable. Our relationship with our own surroundings is often transactional. Their relationship was covenantal. They didn't just occupy a space, they entered into a pact with it. The house was a record of their labor. The willow they cut, the straw they threshed, the clay they trod with their own feet. Its persistence was their persistence. When I stand in my modern home, I appreciate its comfort, but I don't know it. There's no story in the drywall, no memory in the vinyl siding. I think sometimes that we, in gaining perfect comfort, have lost the profound sense of belonging that comes from having literally built your own shelter from the bones of the land itself. That's a different kind of wealth, one that doesn't translate to a bank statement, but that fortifies the soul against a different kind of poverty. Step into the very heart of every medieval home, the living, beating core, the hearth. If the walls and roof formed the shell that held warmth, the fire was the heart that gave it life, the center of existence. Yet, to truly grasp this, we must bridge a gap so wide it takes effort. Fire in that world bore no resemblance to ours. It wasn't switched on when you felt cold and switched off when you were comfortable. Strangely enough, its primary purpose wasn't even heating. Fire was life itself. It was light when darkness fell at 4 in the afternoon in December and held until 8 the next morning. 16 hours of absolute black. No street lamps, no faint glow from neighboring houses, only a darkness so thick it pressed against the skin. Fire cooked every meal, boiled water safe to drink, softened tough roots into stew, turned grain into porridge. It drew the household together. Work happened here. Stories were told. Children were taught. And yes, it warmed. But that warmth felt almost incidental. A generous side effect of light, of food, of shared presence. The hearth sat dead center in the single room, not tucked against a wall with a chimney, but an open pit, perhaps edged with flat stones or simply bare packed earth. Flames radiated outward in every direction. In the early medieval centuries especially, no chimney existed above it. Smoke rose into the rafters, drifted through the thatch, and slowly seeped away. You might picture choking misery. For them, the smoke had purpose. It preserved the roof, repelling insects and rot. More crucially, it formed a warm, hazy blanket suspended overhead, insulating the living space below from the frigid thatch. People learned to inhabit the lower half of the room, sitting, crouching, kneeling, lying down. The upper half belonged to smoke, shadow, and stored heat. What moves me most every time I dwell on it is this. The fire was almost never allowed to die. From the moment it was first kindled, perhaps on a wedding day when a young couple began their own household, it endured. Through seasons, through years, sometimes through decades. The same flame, day after day, night after night. Letting it go out meant crisis. Starting fire from nothing was no simple task. No flick of a lighter, no match strike. It demanded patience and craft. Flint and steel coaxing tiny sparks into tinder, gentle breaths nursing them into glow, kindling added with care. In winter, with everything sodden, it could prove impossible. So the fire was tended, fed, protected. If humanly possible, it never died. By day, it burned openly for cooking and light. As evening settled and the family prepared for sleep, the fire was banked, an ancient art most of us have forgotten. You didn't simply let it fade. You arranged the logs and embers with precision, perhaps drawing them closer, adding one or two larger pieces, then, crucially, buried them beneath a thick mound of ash. Ash, the grey residue we dismiss as waste, was treasure in a medieval home. Saved carefully beside the hearth, it worked magic when heaped over coals. It starved the fire of oxygen. The flames vanished. The glow dimmed. Yet the fire did not perish. It slowed to a deep, patient smoulder, releasing heat so gradually that a well-banked hearth could last 12, 14 hours through the longest night without a single new stick. In the morning, the room was bitter, breath visible in clouds. But beneath the ashen blanket, life persisted. A gentle stir with a poker revealed dull red embers, still alive. A soft breath brightened them. A few dry twigs, another breath. Within minutes, the same fire rekindled. Bright, familiar, unbroken. That continuity saved labor and time, but it carried deeper meaning. The perpetual fire was the soul of the household. As long as it burned, the family endured. The family fed the fire with gathered wood. The fire, in turn, fed the family with warmth and cooked food. It was partnership, symbiosis, a quiet covenant between people and flame. Fuel came mostly from wood, but not the neat split cords we buy today. Great oaks and elms belonged to the Lord. Peasants gathered what the forest freely dropped: fallen branches, standing deadwood. An ancient rite called fireboat allowed them to take whatever a hook or crook could reach. Hence our phrase, by hook or by crook. Although children became experts at foraging, learning which woods burned long and hot, which kindled quickly, returning with bundles that might last only a day or two. In regions where trees grew scarce, peat often took its place. Partly decayed plant matter layered in bogs over millennia. Cutting and drying peat was grueling, yet once ready, it smouldered steadily, ideal for holding fire through endless winter nights. I often linger on the feeling these fires evoke, a feeling hard to name. In our world, fire is rare, brief, controlled. Birthday candles, summer campfires, gas rings that ignite and vanish at a button's touch. For us, fire is a tool, summoned, dismissed, without continuity or presence. For a medieval family, fire was more intimate, closer to a living companion than an appliance. You fed it, sheltered it from drafts, read its moods in flame color and smoke drift. In the deepest winter dark, when cold could kill within hours, that quiet glow at the room's center marked the narrow border between living and dying. Something profound lies in that relationship, something we have lost. We gained freedom from the ceaseless tending of flame, and that freedom is precious. I'm not suggesting we return, yet we also lost a certain closeness to the elemental forces that sustain us. We no longer receive the daily reminder that life depends on transformation, on matter becoming energy before our eyes. A medieval child understood fire in a way even a modern physicist might never feel in the bones. That child knew its temperament, its preferences, its scents and colors, mastered the art of banking and rekindling. That knowledge lived in hands, eyes, nose, an embodied wisdom largely vanished now. We can explain combustion, describe heat transfer, but we do not know fire the way they knew it. We do not live with it the way they lived with it. And I wonder whether that absence carries a cost, whether our separation from the physical processes that keep us alive leaves us more fragile than we realize. We eat food from unknown places, grown by unseen methods, warmed by hidden mechanisms, comfortable, safe, yet subtly disconnected. And sometimes disconnection itself is a quiet vulnerability. This has been on my mind lately. We speak of mastering nature, of harnessing energy. Our language is one of domination. Theirs was a language of negotiation, of attentive partnership. The fire wasn't mastered. It was understood, respected, and perpetually bargained with. Letting it die felt like a moral failure because it was a rupture in that vital relationship. We've swapped that intimate negotiation for the sterile reliability of a thermostat. The gain in ease is incalculable, a blessing I give thanks for every cold morning. But the loss is a subtle one, the loss of that daily, tangible dialogue with a fundamental force. We no longer need to read the world's signs to survive it. And in that safety, I wonder if a certain kind of literacy, a literacy of wind, flame, and material, has faded from our hands, leaving us fluent in abstraction but illiterate in the very elements that sustain us. And, you know, whenever I reach this part of the story, I have to pause. I think about my own relationship with fire. If my pilot light goes out, I call a technician. It's a problem to be solved. But for them, the fire was a silent member of the household. Its steady presence was a kind of promise. We talk today about maintaining the home fires as a metaphor, but for them, it was literal. Letting it die wasn't just an inconvenience. It felt like a moral failure, a break in a vow made to your own future. There's a humility in that which touches me. We command our environment. They negotiated with theirs. They understood the flame as something both servant and sovereign. You fed it, but your life depended on its grace. That's a partnership we've unlearned. Now, a fire can keep you warm while it burns. But what about the hours of the night when fuel must be conserved? What about the time between when you bank the fire at dark and when you wake at dawn? What about the fact that even banked, a fire in the center of an open room radiates heat in all directions, much of it wasted? This is where another simple trick came into play: the warming stone. The concept is so basic that we might dismiss it. We might think, oh yes, hot rocks, how primitive. But in practice, it was remarkably effective. And the principle behind it is the same principle that modern radiant floor heating and thermal mass heating systems use, just in a much simpler form. During the day, when the fire burned bright for cooking and light, a family would select certain stones and place them directly in or very close to the fire. Not just any stones, though. This is important. The wrong kind of stone could crack or even explode when heated. Stones with moisture trapped inside them, or with certain crystal structures that expand unevenly when heated, are dangerous. River stones generally worked well, if they were the right type. They'd been tumbled smooth by water, and any weak ones had already broken apart. Sandstone was good, dense, fine-grained, solid. Granite could work. Limestone, if you were careful. Families learned through experience, and sometimes through painful accidents, which stones from their local area were safe. These stones would sit in the fire all day, positioned right in the coals or propped up on the edge of the fire pit where flames could lick against them. Slowly, slowly, over the course of hours, they would heat up. By evening, by the time the family was preparing for bed, these stones would be almost too hot to approach. If you dripped water on them, it would hiss and evaporate instantly. The stone would be glowing, not visibly red usually, but radiating heat you could feel from a foot away. Then came the careful part. Using wooden tongs, specially made for this purpose, basically two sticks bound together at one end with leather or rope so they could grip, someone would lift these stones out of the fire. Usually, this was one of the adults, the father or mother, because the danger was real. Drop a hot stone and you could burn your feet, even through shoes. Drop it on a child and you could cause terrible injury. They would wrap the stones in layers of wool or old cloth. Heavy wrapping. The cloth had to be thick enough to protect whoever carried the stone, but not so thick that it blocked all the heat. This wrapping created an insulating layer that slowed the release of heat. Instead of the stone cooling down in an hour, giving off all its warmth in one intense burst, the wrapping allowed it to radiate heat slowly, steadily, for hours. Then these wrapped stones would be placed under the sleeping pallets. Medieval peasants did not sleep in beds as we know them. They did not have mattresses and box springs and metal frames. They slept on simple wooden platforms built against the wall of the house, or sometimes on raised areas of packed earth covered with boards. These platforms would be covered with a thick layer of straw or dried heather for cushioning. Wool blankets would be spread on top of the straw, and the family would sleep on these blankets with more blankets pulled over them. The heated stone, wrapped in cloth, would be placed under this platform, usually positioned toward the middle, under where someone's torso or legs would be. The heat would radiate upward through the straw and into the blankets and sleeping bodies above. It was gentle heat, not intense, not direct, but present, constant. A warmth rising from below that made the bed feel less hostile, less cold when you first lay down in it. On the coldest nights, a family might use several stones. A large one for the parents' sleeping area, smaller ones for each of the children. These stones would stay warm for hours, well into the night. Deep into the coldest hours before dawn, you could reach down through the straw and feel the gentle heat still emanating from them. Not hot anymore, but warm, noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. I want you to imagine this for a moment, because I think there is something in it that speaks to human ingenuity at its most fundamental level. You have no electricity, no way to store heat except in the material itself. No understanding of thermodynamics or specific heat capacity or any of the scientific principles that we now use to explain why this works. All you know is that certain rocks, when placed in fire, stay hot for a long time. Longer than anything else. And so you use them, you wrap them, you position them carefully under where you'll sleep, and they work. They make the unbearable bearable. They make the cold night survivable. But there is more, because this same principle, this understanding that mass holds heat, applied to the entire structure of the house. Remember those thick walls of clay and earth I described? Those walls weren't just insulation, they were thermal mass. During the day, they absorbed heat from the fire, from the weak winter sun if it managed to shine through the small windows. They heated up slowly, so slowly you would not notice it happening. If you placed your hand on the wall in the morning and then again in the evening, you might not feel much difference. But the wall was warmer, measurably warmer. It had absorbed hundreds, thousands of BTUs of thermal energy. And then, through the night, they released that heat, just as slowly. The fire in the center of the room might be banked to almost nothing, giving off minimal warmth. The small windows were shuttered against the cold. The door was barred. And yet the temperature inside dropped much more slowly than it would in a modern house with thin walls, because the walls themselves were radiating, giving back the heat they'd absorbed during the day. The floor, too. The floor of a medieval peasant house was not wood, as we might expect. It was earth, packed hard from years of use, of feet walking over it, of furniture being dragged across it, of daily life. Often the earth was mixed with other materials to make it harder. Ox blood was sometimes used, the proteins binding the soil particles together. Crushed lime, clay. The result was a floor that was almost like stone, hard, durable, and with significant thermal mass. This floor, too, absorbed heat during the day. Heat from the fire radiating downward. Heat from the sun, if it shone through the door when it was opened. Heat from the bodies of people and animals moving across it. And at night, it gave that heat back. Slowly, imperceptibly, but measurably. In effect, the entire house was a heat battery. Every surface capable of holding warmth did so. The walls, the floor, even the air itself, especially the layer of warm, smoky air trapped up in the rafters. All of it together created an environment where, even when the fire burned low, even when the outside temperature dropped well below freezing, the inside remained tolerable. Now, I said tolerable. Not comfortable by our standards, not warm in the way we think of warm. A medieval peasant house in winter, even a well-built one with a good fire, might only maintain an internal temperature in the 40s Fahrenheit. That's cold. Cold enough that you'd want to stay dressed. Cold enough that you wouldn't want to sit still for too long. But it was above the point where water freezes. Above the point where exposed skin develops frostbite. Above the point where hypothermia becomes an immediate danger. And that was enough. That margin, those degrees of difference between inside and outside, between freezing and not quite freezing, was life. There is a story I came across years ago, reading medieval monastic records. I cannot verify if every detail is true, but it captures something important. A monastery, I think it was in northern France, kept meticulous records of daily prayers and activities. This was common in monasteries. The monks documented everything, and in one winter entry, dated to sometime in the 1300s, a monk noted that the ink in his inkwell froze during morning prayers. It turned to sludge, impossible to write with. He had to hold the inkwell in his hands, warming it with his body heat before he could continue his copying work. But then, in the same entry, he added a note. He said this happened in the scriptorium, the dedicated writing room, which was kept unheated to prevent fire risk among all the precious manuscripts. But in the dormitory where the monks slept, and in the warming room where they were allowed to have a fire during winter months, the temperature never dropped to freezing, not even in the worst storms. This tells us something important. These people understood microclimates. They understood that not every space needed to be equally warm, that you could have different zones in a building serving different purposes. They concentrated their heat, their precious fuel, in the spaces where they spent the most time, where they slept, where they gathered. The scriptorium could be freezing, and that was acceptable, because monks only went there for specific work and could bundle up while they did it. The single room where a peasant family ate, worked, and slept was where all effort went into maintaining warmth. Storage rooms, if there were any, could be cold. animal pens attached to the house could be cold. Even small workshops or dairies attached to the main dwelling could be allowed to freeze. That was acceptable. What mattered was that the core space, the heart of the home where human bodies needed to survive, remained warm enough for life. And there is a wisdom in that which I think we have forgotten. We heat our entire houses, every room, to the same temperature, whether we use those rooms or not. We have guest bedrooms that are heated to 70 degrees all winter, even though no one sleeps in them for months. We have formal dining rooms kept warm, even though we eat in the kitchen. We have living rooms maintained at a comfortable temperature, even when the whole family is gathered in a single room watching television. There is something inefficient, even absurd about this when you think about it. We are heating space, empty space, space that contains no human life. We do it because we can, because energy is cheap enough, or at least has been, that we don't have to think carefully about where we use it. But the medieval peasant, with none of our resources, understood something we have overlooked. Heat what you use. Focus your energy. Make every bit of warmth count. Don't waste precious fuel warming empty air. And this principle extended beyond just the house itself. It extended to the bed, to the sleeping arrangements. Let me tell you something that might seem strange. Medieval people did not heat their beds. There were no electric blankets, obviously, no heated mattresses, no hot water bottles, though the warming stones served a similar function. The bed itself was cold when you got into it. The air in the room was cold. Your breath made clouds. So, what did they do? They slept in their clothes. Not completely dressed, perhaps. The heaviest outer layers might be removed. A wet or muddy cloak would be hung up. Heavy shoes would be taken off. But the underlayers, the wool tunic or dress, the wool stockings, those stayed on. Because the bed itself was cold. Getting into a cold bed while naked would be unbearable, dangerous even. Hypothermia is a real risk when you're cold and then lie down without moving. Your body stops generating heat through activity. Your core temperature can drop, so people slept clothed. The clothes they had worn during the day became their pajamas at night. And those clothes, having been worn all day, having absorbed the wearer's body heat, were already slightly warm when sleep began. They provided an immediate first layer of insulation between cold air and warm skin. This seems strange to us. We change into special clothes for sleeping. We value cleanliness and freshness. We wash our pajamas regularly and wouldn't dream of wearing day clothes to bed. But in a world where making clothes took months of labor, where washing was difficult and drying even more so, where staying warm was more important than staying clean in any modern sense, these priorities made perfect sense. Let me share something personal here. My grandfather told me I must have been 8 or 9 years old about his childhood in the 1920s. This was in rural Pennsylvania, in a house that had some modern conveniences, but not many. He said that in winter, the upstairs where the children slept was unheated. There was a stove downstairs in the kitchen, but no heat went upstairs. And he said the water in the wash basin in his room would freeze overnight. Every morning, there would be ice. He and his brothers slept in their clothes under a pile of quilts his grandmother had made. And he said, You didn't dawdle getting into bed. You ran upstairs, jumped under the covers, and stayed there until morning. That was only 100 years ago. Not medieval times, not ancient history, my grandfather's childhood. And yet the experience of winter cold, the strategies for dealing with it, were not so different from what medieval peasants faced. The technology had changed a little, but the fundamental realities remained, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said that when he woke up in the morning, when he had to leave that warm nest of blankets and venture into the freezing room, that was the hardest part of the day. Everything else was easier. But that moment of leaving warmth, of forcing yourself into the cold, took willpower, took courage, almost. And he said that modern children like me growing up in heated houses, would never understand that, would never know what it was to face cold like that every single morning. He was right. I don't understand it. Not really. I know it intellectually, but I've never lived it. I've never had to summon courage just to get out of bed because of cold. And most of you listening probably haven't either. We wake up in rooms that are, at worst, slightly chilly, not dangerous, not painful, just mildly uncomfortable. And even that mild discomfort we usually eliminate with a quick adjustment of the thermostat. We are protected in ways that most humans throughout history were not. And that protection is a gift. But it's also, in a strange way, a loss. Because we no longer have the opportunity to develop that particular kind of resilience. That daily test, that small triumph of will over discomfort. My grandfather had that. Medieval peasants had that. We don't. And I sometimes wonder if that matters. If there's a kind of strength that can only come from facing real hardship, even small real hardship, on a regular basis. My grandfather's story wasn't a lament. He told it with a kind of rugged pride. That daily confrontation with the cold had forged in him a certain unshakable confidence. He knew, in his bones, that he could endure. That knowledge is a form of strength we rarely cultivate now. We've outsourced our resilience. Our comfort systems are also, in a way, our insulation from our own capabilities. We've eliminated the need for that morning courage, and that is a humanitarian triumph. But it also means we must now choose to develop strength, rather than having it demanded of us by the dawn. The medieval peasant and my grandfather didn't have a choice. Their resilience was a necessity, etched into them by the season itself. Our task, in our perpetual comfort, is different but no less vital. To remember that the warmth we enjoy is not a default state of the universe, but a hard-won miracle. And to ensure that in securing our comfort, we do not become strangers to our own profound, enduring toughness. But let me return to the warming stones, because there's more to understand about them. The use of heated stones for warmth wasn't unique to medieval Europe. It appears in cultures all over the world, wherever people faced cold and had fire. Native American tribes used similar techniques. Asian cultures, Nordic peoples. It's one of those universal human innovations that appears independently because the logic is so clear once you've felt how long a hot stone stays warm. But medieval Europeans developed particular variations. In some regions, especially in places where stone was scarce, people used heated bricks instead. Clay bricks, if a family was wealthy enough to have them, or homemade mud bricks dried in the sun during summer. These worked even better than stones in some ways, because bricks are more uniform. You knew exactly how much heat they would hold, how long they would stay warm. There are records from the 16th century, from Tudor England, of wealthy merchants and minor nobility using specially made bed-warming devices, brass or copper containers with hinged lids and long handles. You would fill these with hot coals from the fire, close the lid, and run the device between the sheets of your bed before getting in. The heat would warm the linens, make the bed less shockingly cold. But peasants couldn't afford brass containers. They used stones wrapped in cloth. Or in some cases, they used hot water. If you had a container that wouldn't leak or crack from heat, a sealed pottery jug for instance, you could fill it with boiling water and use it the same way. Water holds heat remarkably well. It has a very high specific heat capacity, which means it takes a lot of energy to raise its temperature, but once heated, it releases that energy slowly. A jug of boiling water could stay warm for hours. I think about the ingenuity required to figure this out, to observe that different materials hold heat for different lengths of time, to experiment, to pass this knowledge down. No one wrote it in a textbook. No scientist explained thermal capacity. But people learned through experience, through trial and error, through generations of accumulated observation. And what they learned worked. Now let me tell you something that connects to this. Something about how medieval people understood their bodies and temperature. They didn't think about it the way we do. We have precise thermometers. We know that human body temperature should be 98, 6 degrees Fahrenheit. We understand fever and hypothermia in clinical terms. They didn't have any of that. But they understood warmth and cold in a different way, a more experiential way. They knew that cold crept into the body from the extremities, that feet and hands got cold first, that keeping your core warm was most important. They understood, probably better than we do, what it felt like to be truly cold. Not just uncomfortable, but dangerously cold, when your fingers stop working properly, when you can't grip things anymore, when shivering becomes so violent you can't control it, when your thinking slows down, when you start to feel sleepy despite the danger. These were not abstract concepts to them. These were experiences they had or had seen in others. People died of cold regularly, especially the very young and the very old. But even healthy adults could succumb if they got wet in winter, or fell through ice, or got caught in a blizzard without shelter. So the warming stone under the bed was not a luxury. It was not a comfort item. It was survival technology. It could mean the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up, especially for children, especially for the elderly. Their bodies couldn't generate enough heat on their own on the coldest nights. The external heat source, that stone radiating warmth from below, gave them enough of an edge to survive. And I think we need to sit with that for a moment, to really understand what it means. These people lived so close to the edge. The margin between life and death was so thin. A few degrees of temperature, a handful of innovations, knowledge passed from parent to child. That was all that stood between survival and oblivion. So far, I have talked about individual houses, individual families. But we cannot understand medieval winter survival without understanding how houses related to each other, how families related to each other, how the village itself, the community, became a kind of organism working together to generate and preserve warmth. When you look at medieval villages that still exist, or read descriptions from period documents, or study archaeological evidence of how villages were laid out, a pattern emerges. A pattern that seems almost accidental at first, but reveals itself to be deeply intentional when you understand the reasoning behind it. Houses were not spread out. They were clustered together, tightly, much more tightly than we build communities today, where every house sits on its own plot of land, separated from neighbors by yards and fences and space. Medieval houses often shared walls, or sat so close together that you could reach out a window and almost touch the house next door. This was not just because land within the village was limited, though that was part of it. Most of the land around a village was agricultural, divided into long strips in the open fields where grain was grown. The village itself, the built-up area where houses stood, was kept deliberately compact. And this compactness served a purpose. Multiple purposes, actually. First, and most obviously, clustered houses shared heat. If your house shared a wall with your neighbor's house, both houses benefited. Think about the physics of it. A freestanding house loses heat through all of its walls. Every exterior surface is bleeding warmth into the cold air outside. But if one wall is shared, if it's an interior wall between two dwellings, then any heat that passes through that wall doesn't escape. It just moves from one warm space to another warm space. The heat stays within the community. This is the same principle that modern apartment buildings use. The units in the middle of the building, with neighbors on multiple sides, require far less heating than corner units that have more exterior walls exposed to weather. Medieval villagers understood this principle through experience, even without the ability to measure or quantify it precisely. But there's more. The clustering of houses created windbreaks. Wind is the enemy of warmth. Wind strips away the thin layer of warm air that clings to surfaces. It drives cold air into every crack and crevice. It sucks heat out of buildings far more effectively than still air does. This is what we call the wind chill effect. The air temperature might be 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but if there's a strong wind, it feels much colder because the wind is removing heat from exposed skin so rapidly. By clustering houses together, villages created zones of relative calm. The outer ring of houses took the brunt of the wind. They shielded the inner houses. If you lived in the center of the village, your house was protected by the houses around it. The wind had to curve around the entire settlement to reach you, and by the time it did, it had lost much of its force. And villages were deliberately built with some natural feature protecting them from the prevailing wind. This was not accidental. When choosing where to build, whether establishing a new settlement or relocating an existing one, people looked for natural shelter. A hill to the north or west, whichever direction the worst winds came from. A thick stand of trees. A curve in a river valley that created a pocket of calm air. These features were valued because they meant survival. I came across a medieval document once, a land charter from somewhere in the English Midlands, probably 13th century. It described a village location as sheltered from the wolf wind by the old wood. The wolf wind, that phrase stuck with me. The wind that came in winter, cold enough to kill. And the village was placed deliberately to be sheltered from it by a nearby forest. If no natural protection existed, villagers created it. They planted hedgerows, dense, thick barriers of thorny shrubs like hawthorn or blackthorn. These hedgerows served multiple purposes. They marked boundaries between properties. They kept livestock contained. They provided berries and nuts, but they also blocked wind. A mature hedgerow, 8 or 10 feet tall and just as thick, was as effective as a wall for breaking wind. And the houses themselves were arranged strategically. The outermost houses, the ones that would face the full force of winter storms, were often built more solidly, thicker walls, better maintained thatch, and the people who lived in those outer houses were often the more prosperous families, who could afford the extra fuel needed to stay warm in a more exposed location. The poorest families often lived more toward the center of the village. This might seem backwards to our modern thinking, where the center of town is usually the most expensive, most desirable location. But in medieval terms, the center was safest, most protected, easiest to keep warm. So the most vulnerable families, the ones with the least resources, were placed where surviving was slightly easier. This was not formalized policy in most places, not written down, but it was understood. It was how things worked. The community organized itself to maximize everyone's chances of survival. Because a village where people froze to death was a weakened village. Every death was a loss of labor, of knowledge, of potential. Now, let me tell you about another aspect of village layout that fascinated me when I first learned about it. The orientation of houses, the direction they faced. This was not random. Houses were built facing south whenever the land and the layout of the village permitted. South-facing meant that the main door and whatever small windows existed received the maximum amount of sunlight during the short winter days. In Northern Europe, in December and January, the sun never rises very high in the sky. It traces a low arc across the southern horizon. A north-facing house would be in shadow all day, but a south-facing house would catch those weak rays of winter sun. And even weak winter sun provides warmth. Not much, but some. The dark daub walls would absorb whatever solar heat they could. The temperature inside a house that caught a few hours of winter sun might be 2 or 3 degrees warmer than an identical house that remained in shadow all day. 2 or 3 degrees. That doesn't sound like much, but it was enough to matter. The northern walls, which faced the coldest winter winds and received no sun, were often built thicker than the other walls. Extra layers of daub, or sometimes, in better houses, a second wall creating an air gap, anything to add insulation on the most vulnerable side. And there's something else about south-facing houses that I find particularly clever. In summer, when the sun is high in the sky, it passes almost directly overhead. So the south-facing door and windows, which are vertical surfaces, don't catch much direct summer sun. They're shaded by the angle of the sun's rays. This means the house stays cooler in summer. But in winter, when the sun is low, Those same openings catch maximum light and warmth. The house was designed to be seasonally responsive, warm when you needed warmth, cool when you needed cool, all without any mechanical systems, just careful orientation and understanding of how the sun moves. Now, I need to tell you about communal gathering. Because the village as a heater was not just about physical layout. It was also about people coming together, literally pressing together for warmth. In many villages, there was a building larger than the ordinary houses. Sometimes it was the manor hall, belonging to the local lord, but used by the community for certain gatherings. Sometimes it was the church, which had heating only on special occasions, but was large enough to hold many people. Sometimes it was simply the largest house in the village, owned by a more prosperous family, but understood to be available in times of need. When a particularly severe storm approached, when the cold became so extreme that individual houses might not provide enough protection, word would spread through the village. Sometimes officially through the village reeve or bailiff making an announcement. Sometimes informally, neighbors telling neighbors. And people would gather. They would bring whatever they could contribute. A bit of food, some firewood or peat, blankets, candles or rushlights. Children would be bundled in every piece of clothing they owned. The elderly would be helped along by younger family members, and they would converge on this central gathering place. Can you imagine it? 40 people, 50, sometimes more, all crowded into a space that in ordinary times might hold 20 comfortably, standing shoulder to shoulder, sitting pressed together on benches or on the floor, children on laps, or nestled between adults, the elderly given the best spots, closest to whatever fire burned in the hearth, but surrounded by younger bodies that would help hold the warmth in. The fire in such a place would be larger than in a typical house. It had to be to have any effect on so many people. But even so, the primary source of warmth was the bodies themselves. Human bodies, simply by being alive, generate heat. About as much as a 75-watt light bulb, give or take. One person, one light bulb's worth of heat. Not much. But 40 people? 50? You're talking about 3,000 watts. 4,000. That's more than most space heaters produce. And this heat wasn't being pumped in from outside and then lost. It was being generated right there by the bodies in the room. And with so many people pressed together, that heat had nowhere to go. It couldn't escape. It accumulated. The temperature in such a gathering could rise by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius compared to outside. 20 degrees. More. I read an account once, I think it was from a parish record in northern England, describing a blizzard in the winter of 1348. That's the year the Black Death arrived in England, so there was a lot of death that year for multiple reasons. But this account was specifically about the blizzard. It lasted 3 days, the record said. 3 days of continuous snow and wind, so fierce that you couldn't see more than a few feet. The temperature dropped far below freezing, and the record said that the villagers gathered in the church, not because of any religious service, but for survival. They brought what food they had. They kept a fire burning in a brazier, which normally wouldn't be allowed in the church, but this was an emergency. And they stayed there, all of them, for the entire 3 days, sleeping on the floor, sharing blankets, singing to keep their spirits up. And when the storm passed, when they were able to return to their individual homes, not a single person had died from the cold. The account specifically noted this as remarkable, because in isolated farmhouses outside the village, families had frozen to death. But the village, by gathering together, by pooling their warmth and resources, had survived intact. There's something profound in that story, something that speaks to the power of community in the most literal physical sense. These people saved each other's lives by being together, by sharing space, by sharing the heat of their bodies. In a modern crisis, we tend to think in terms of resources. Who has food? Who has fuel? Who has shelter? And those things matter. But medieval people understood that humans themselves were a resource, that our bodies, our presence, our physical warmth had value. That sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply be there, be present, add your body's heat to the collective pool of warmth. And these gatherings served another purpose beyond mere physical survival. They maintained morale. They preserved sanity. Winter was long, depressingly long. In Northern Europe, the period from late October, when the days grew short and the cold began, to early April, when spring finally arrived, could feel like an eternity. Almost 6 months of cold and darkness and confinement. In individual houses, isolated, people could fall into despair. The darkness wore on you. The cold wore on you. The monotony, the lack of work to do outdoors. The cabin fever, as we would call it now. This was real. This was dangerous. Depression in winter was not just a matter of feeling sad. It could be life-threatening. People who gave up hope, who stopped caring, who stopped eating or moving or tending to necessities, those people died. But in communal gatherings, there was life. There were stories, songs, jokes, and gossip. Arguments, probably, and tensions, because putting 50 people in close quarters brings out conflict, but also laughter, shared memories, plans for spring, for when the weather would break and work could resume. The act of being together, of talking and listening and participating in communal life kept despair at bay. It reminded people that they were not alone, that others were experiencing the same hardship, that the cold and dark were not personal punishments but shared challenges, and that together they would make it through to the other side. There's a word I mentioned before, hygge. It's Danish, but the concept existed throughout Northern Europe, though called by different names in different languages. It has no direct English translation, which I think is telling. The closest we can get is something like cozy togetherness or intimate warmth. But that doesn't quite capture it. Hygge describes the feeling of being with people you care about, in a warm and comfortable space, while the world outside is cold and harsh. Sitting around a fire with loved ones, drinking something warm, telling stories, feeling safe and content despite the darkness and cold beyond your walls. It's not just physical warmth, it's emotional and social warmth, a sense of belonging and connection that makes the physical hardship bearable. Medieval villagers, gathering in the church or the manor hall during a blizzard, experienced hygge. They might not have had a word for it, but they knew the feeling, that sense of, we are here together, we are warm together, and that is enough. And I think we've lost something of this. We can create hygge in our modern lives, certainly. The concept has been popularized in recent years, but it's harder because we're so rarely forced together by necessity. We gather by choice, for specific purposes, for defined periods of time. But we don't have those long winter nights where the only option is to be together, where survival itself requires presence and proximity. We can retreat to our separate rooms in our separately heated homes. We can be alone whenever we want, and there's value in that. Privacy is good. Solitude can be healing. I'm not arguing against modern comfort, but I am saying that there was something in that forced togetherness, that necessary community that we've lost. And I wonder if that loss contributes to the epidemic of loneliness we see in modern society, the isolation, the sense that many people have of facing the world alone. Medieval peasants could not afford to be lonely. Loneliness in winter was death, so they built systems, social as much as physical, that kept people connected. They gathered. They shared. They depended on each other openly, without shame, because everyone depended on everyone else. And in that mutual dependence, there was community, there was belonging, there was the deep, bone-level knowledge that you mattered.
Not because of what you accomplished or how much money you had, but simply because you were there, because your body added warmth to the room, because your voice added to the conversation, because you were part of the whole, and the whole needed you to survive. All the warmth a medieval home could gather vanished the moment you stepped outside to fetch water, cut wood, tend animals, or visit a neighbour. The house no longer protected you. Your clothing did. In those moments, what you wore decided whether you endured or failed. Today, warmth is engineered. We wear fabrics born in laboratories, light as air, sealed against wind and rain, designed to work without thought. Staying warm is almost effortless. In the medieval world, there was no such luxury. There was wool and almost nothing else. Layer upon layer of it, taken from sheep that filled every village, processed by hand and turned into the only barrier between flesh and lethal cold. That wool was not simply harvested, but earned through endless labour. Once a year, in a narrow window of spring, sheep were shorn. From there began months of work, washing filthy fleece in cold water, carding fibres into order, spinning thread hour after hour. Spinning never stopped. It followed women through every spare moment of the day because thread was the bottleneck of survival. Without thread, there was no cloth. Without cloth, there was no winter. The garments that emerged were heavy, rough, and burdensome by modern standards. Tunics weighed pounds, cloaks strained the shoulders, stockings scratched. Movement was slow and awkward. Yet within that weight lived an intelligence shaped by experience. Wool trapped air inside its crimped fibres, creating insulation. It absorbed moisture without feeling wet, kept warmth even when damp, and continued to protect when snow or rain soaked through. Cotton would have killed them. Wool saved them. They understood layering instinctively, linen against the skin to manage sweat, wool over wool to trap still air. Stockings pulled high, shoes stuffed with straw, and over everything a thick hooded cloak that cut wind and held heat close. 5 or 6 layers were common, more in deep winter. The body moved inside a pocket of warmth, a fragile microclimate carried through the cold. Clothes were rarely washed. Wet wool was almost impossible to dry in winter. Instead, garments were aired, brushed, mended, worn again. They were slept in because beds were cold and naked skin against straw could be dangerous. At night, the warmth stored in clothing carried the body safely into sleep. Repair was constant. Nothing was discarded. When fabric failed, it became patches. When patches failed, rags. When rags failed, tinder or wall filler. Every thread mattered, because every thread was time. This system was exhausting, but it worked. Everyone was clothed, not fashionably, not comfortably, but sufficiently, warm enough to live. We live differently now. Our closets overflow with clothing made for controlled spaces, thin, disposable, replaceable. We trade durability for ease, protection for appearance. Most of what we wear would fail us quickly in real cold. We have gained comfort, but lost knowledge. Medieval clothing carried an understanding of the body and the environment that lived in hands and habit, not theory. It knew that warmth is not a switch, but a relationship. That survival depends on layers, patience, and materials that forgive moisture and time. We are richer now, safer in many ways, yet in shedding that knowledge, we have also shed a quiet wisdom about what it truly means to be protected from the world. We have talked about houses, about fire, about stone and clothing. We've discussed the village layout and how communities work together. Now, we must talk about something that might seem less technical, but was absolutely essential. Something that required no materials, no construction, no special knowledge, just presence. The warmth of other human beings pressed close together through the long, cold nights. I mentioned earlier that villagers would gather on the worst nights. But this principle of shared warmth extended into daily life, into the very structure of how people slept and lived every single night of winter. Not just during emergencies, every night. This was normal. This was how life worked. A medieval peasant house was typically one room. I've said this before, but let me paint the picture more fully. One room. 12 feet by 12 feet if it was a small house. Perhaps 20 feet by 15 if the family was more prosperous. Not separate spaces, not bedroom and living room and kitchen. Just one open space with a fire in the middle and everything else arranged around it. In that one room lived an entire extended family. Not just parents and their children, often grandparents, sometimes unmarried aunts or uncles, occasionally hired workers if the family had any means at all. Adult children who hadn't yet married and set up their own households. Everyone who belonged to that family unit lived in that one space, 6 people in one room was normal. 8 or 10 was common. In some cases, particularly in harsh regions like northern Scotland or Norway, or during times of crisis when families took in displaced relatives, even more people would crowd into a single dwelling. 12 people. 15. I've read records of houses where 20 people lived in a space not much bigger than a modern living room. And where did all these people sleep? Not in separate beds in separate rooms, not even in separate beds in the same room. They slept together, in one communal sleeping area. In some houses, this was a single large platform built against a wall, raised off the ground to avoid dampness. In other houses, it was several smaller platforms arranged next to each other with no space between. But in either case, people slept close, very close, pressed together, sharing warmth. The arrangement followed a pattern. This wasn't random. It was strategic, carefully thought out to maximize the survival of the most vulnerable members of the family. The youngest children slept in the middle. This was crucial. Children, with their smaller bodies and higher surface area to volume ratio, lose heat faster than adults. A child can develop hypothermia in conditions that an adult would find merely uncomfortable. So children were placed where they would be surrounded by warmth on all sides, sandwiched between adult bodies, protected. Often 2 or 3 small children would sleep pressed against each other, their combined body heat keeping all of them warmer than any one could be alone. An older child might be assigned to sleep with a baby, using their larger body to shelter the infant through the night. The parents slept on one side of the children, grandparents or other elders on the other side. The elderly also lose heat more easily than younger adults. Their metabolism's slow, their circulation isn't as good. They feel cold more acutely. So they were placed near the center, between the children and the younger parents, where they would benefit from the heat of other bodies, while also staying closer to the fire that burned through the night in the center of the room. The young adults, the teenagers, and young men and women of working age slept on the outer edges if they slept on the platform at all. They were the most cold-resistant. Their bodies generated the most heat, so they formed a protective outer layer, buffering the more vulnerable people in the center from the cold walls and air. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the frost crept up the walls despite the fire, the entire family might sleep under a single large blanket, or more often, under several blankets piled on top of each other. Every piece of wool fabric the family owned layered over the sleeping bodies. Bodies pressed together, breath mingling in the cold air, the sound of breathing, of movements, of the occasional cough or whisper, all mixing together in the darkness. Let me ask you to imagine this. Really imagine it. Close your eyes if you want. Picture yourself in that space. It's dark. The only light is the dull glow of the banked fire in the center of the room, mostly buried under ash, but still radiating a little warmth. You can see your breath when you exhale. The air is cold enough that your nose hurts slightly. But under the layers of blankets, pressed between other people, you're warm. Not comfortable exactly. There's not enough room to stretch out. Someone's elbow is in your back. Someone else is snoring. A child is fidgeting. But you're warm. And that warmth is life. For us, this would be claustrophobic, intolerable. We've been taught that personal space is important, that privacy is a human need. that healthy individuals need their own separate sleeping areas. We value independence, self-sufficiency, the ability to retreat into our own private spaces when we want to. And maybe those things are valuable. Maybe privacy does matter. But it's also a luxury that medieval people could not afford during the months when cold could kill. During winter, the need for warmth trumped the desire for privacy. Survival took precedence over comfort. And something happened in that pressed-together warmth. Something beyond mere physical survival. Something that's hard for us to fully understand from our position of comfortable isolation. Families became bonded in a way that is difficult to replicate in modern life. The ties between people who have slept through 100 winter nights, sharing warmth, listening to each other breathe, feeling each other's presence in the dark. Those ties were different from the bonds between people who sleep in separate, climate-controlled bedrooms and only see each other at scheduled mealtimes. I'm not romanticizing this. I'm sure there were arguments. I'm sure people got on each other's nerves. I'm sure parents longed for a moment of privacy and children wished they could spread out, and everyone occasionally wanted space that didn't exist. The reality of living in such close quarters must have been difficult in ways we can barely imagine. But there was also an intimacy, a shared experience of vulnerability and mutual dependence that created deep connections. You knew, on a visceral level, that you were keeping your children alive by letting them sleep pressed against your body. That your elderly parents were surviving the night because of the heat radiating from you. That you, in turn, were warmer because of them. This wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. It was something you felt, literally felt, every night. The elderly, in particular, benefited from this arrangement in ways that go beyond just physical warmth. In modern society, we often isolate our elderly. We put them in separate homes, assisted living facilities, nursing homes. Those of us who don't do that often give them their own separate living spaces within family homes. A mother-in-law suite, a bedroom on the main floor away from everyone else. We think we're being kind, giving them privacy and quiet, but isolation kills. This is not metaphorical. There are studies showing that isolated elderly people die sooner, get sicker, suffer more from depression and cognitive decline. Social connection, regular human contact, is as important for health as diet or exercise, maybe more important. In a medieval household, an elderly person was quite literally kept warm by the presence of their children and grandchildren. They fell asleep each night feeling the life and heat of the younger generation pressed against their backs. They woke in the morning surrounded by family. They were not separate, not isolated. They were integrated into the physical space of the family unit. And this physical closeness meant they were valued. Not just emotionally, though that was part of it, but practically. They knew they were contributing even in their diminished state because their body heat, reduced as it was compared to younger adults, still contributed to the family's survival. A fire producing 75 watts of heat is better than no fire at all. An elderly body maintaining the warmth in the shared sleeping area was valuable. This gave them purpose. It confirmed their place in the family structure. They were not a burden. They were part of the system, part of the survival strategy. And I think that mattered. I think knowing you're useful, even in small ways, even just by being present, matters for psychological health in a way we don't fully appreciate. Now, this principle of shared warmth extended beyond the nuclear or extended family. It extended into the broader community. I talked about how villagers would gather in a central building during severe storms. Let me describe that in more detail, because it's remarkable. When word spread that a serious storm was coming, families would prepare. This preparation was based on experience, on the accumulated wisdom of generations. They knew what to bring, what would be needed. Food, obviously. Whatever could be easily transported. Bread, cheese, dried meat if they had any. Vegetables that kept well, like turnips or parsnips. Nothing that required elaborate preparation, because cooking facilities in the gathering place would be limited. But enough food to feed the family for potentially days if the storm was severe. Fuel for fire. Every family that could manage it would bring something. A bundle of sticks, some peat, a few split logs if they had wood to spare. The fire in the gathering place needed to be kept burning constantly, and that required more fuel than one family could reasonably contribute. So everyone brought what they could. The contributions were pooled. The fire belonged to everyone. Blankets, every spare piece of wool fabric, cloaks, old clothes that weren't being worn, anything that could provide an extra layer of warmth. These too would be shared, spread over groups of people. Babies would be wrapped in whatever soft fabric was available. The elderly would be given the best pieces. And then the families would arrive at the gathering place. Usually in the late afternoon, before darkness made travel dangerous. Parents carrying children. Young men carrying their elderly grandparents on their backs if the old ones couldn't walk well in snow. Everyone bundled in every layer they owned. And they would settle in, find spaces on the floor, arrange themselves along the walls. The areas closest to the fire were reserved for those who needed warmth most. The very young, the very old, pregnant women, anyone who was sick or weak. These people got prime positions where the fire's heat would reach them directly. But everyone else crowded in close, sitting shoulder to shoulder, backs against the walls or against each other for support. Children on laps or nestled between adults. The able-bodied young men often stood or sat near the doors and windows in the coldest spots because they could tolerate cold better than others. As more families arrived, the space got more crowded until there was barely room to move. Bodies pressed together everywhere you looked, and in that crushing, uncomfortable proximity, warmth built up. The air temperature in the room rose, not dramatically, not to anything we would call warm, but noticeably, measurably. The difference between freezing and not freezing. And people would stay like this for hours, all night often, sometimes for multiple days if the storm was severe. They couldn't just sleep, because sleeping in extreme cold, especially while sitting upright or in awkward positions, was dangerous. So they stayed awake, or at least they cycled through sleep in shifts. Some people sleeping, while others stayed awake to tend the fire and watch for problems, and to pass the time, to keep spirits up, to prevent the despair that could set in during these ordeals. They talked. They told stories. Old stories, traditional tales that everyone had heard before but still enjoyed. Stories of ancestors, of other hard winters that had been survived, of springs and summers past, of weddings and harvests and good times. They sang work songs, folk songs, religious hymns if the gathering was in a church, silly songs the children liked. The singing served multiple purposes. It kept people awake, it lifted moods, and it created a sense of unity, of shared purpose. When 50 voices are singing together, you feel part of something larger than yourself. You feel less alone. They prayed, of course. This was a deeply religious society. When facing danger, people turned to God. They asked for protection, for the storm to pass, for strength to endure. Whether the prayers were heard or effective is a question I cannot answer. But they provided comfort. They gave people something to do, a sense that they were not entirely helpless. And they gossiped, of course. Humans gossip. It's one of our fundamental social activities. Who was courting whom? Which family's roof needed repair? Who had offended whom and needed to apologize? Gossip served social functions. It reinforced norms. It maintained community bonds. And in these gatherings, it passed the time. There must have been conflicts too, I'm sure of it. Put 50 people in close quarters under stress, and conflicts will emerge. Arguments over space, over whose children were being too loud, over who brought enough food and who didn't. Old grudges surfacing, tensions that had been simmering breaking out into open disputes. But there must also have been mechanisms for resolving these conflicts, or at least containing them, because the alternative was chaos. And chaos in a survival situation means death. So probably the village elders intervened. The wealthiest or most respected families enforced peace. The priest, if one was present, called for Christian charity and forgiveness. However it happened, order was maintained. It had to be. And when the storm passed, when the wind died and the snow stopped, and people could finally return to their individual homes, not a single person had frozen. The community had survived intact. That was the goal. That was success. There are records scattered through medieval documents of villagers that did this, that gathered during storms and came through without loss. And there are also records, tragic ones, of isolated farmhouses where families died, where parents and children froze to death because they faced the cold alone, without the buffering warmth of community. The contrast is stark. It's a lesson written in survival and death. Together, humans can withstand conditions that would kill them individually. The simple act of being present, of adding your body's heat to the collective pool, of sharing space and breath and warmth. That act saves lives. We don't live like this anymore. We don't have to, thank God. Our heated homes protect us. But I wonder sometimes if we've lost something important. Not the discomfort of crowding, nobody wants that, but the bone-deep knowledge that we need each other, that isolation is dangerous, that community is not just a nice idea, but a survival necessity. Modern research on loneliness supports this. People who are socially isolated have significantly higher mortality rates. They develop more chronic diseases. They suffer more from mental illness. Their immune systems don't function as well. Loneliness literally makes you sick. But we've built a society where isolation is easy, where you can live alone, work alone, spend entire days without meaningful human contact, where you can be surrounded by millions of people in a city and still feel completely alone. Medieval peasants couldn't do that. Isolation wasn't an option. They were forced into community, forced into physical proximity, forced to deal with each other every single day. And while that must have been difficult in many ways, it also meant they were never truly alone, never cut off, always embedded in a web of human relationships that, whatever their flaws, provided connection and meaning. We are nearly at the end of our journey. But before I leave you to your warm night, there is one last thing to understand. Food. Staying warm in winter was not only about fire outside the body, but fire within it. Medieval people did not know the language of calories or metabolism, yet they understood, through lived experience, that what you ate determined how warm and alive you felt. At the heart of winter life was the stew, not an occasional meal, but a constant presence, simmering day and night for months. The pot sat by the fire and was never truly emptied, only replenished. Water or thin broth formed the base, enriched over days and weeks by bones, roots, grains, and whatever scraps could be spared. Turnips, onions, cabbage, peas, barley or oats softened into something filling and sustaining. If fortune allowed, a little salted pork or dried fish flavoured the whole pot, used sparingly but valued deeply, not just for nutrition, but for morale. Herbs, salt, and fat were precious additions, making food safer, easier to digest, and more warming. This slow, constant simmer meant hot food was always ready, nothing was wasted, and illness was less likely. Eating hot stew warmed the body from the inside, raising core temperature, improving circulation, and making cold days survivable. Fatty foods were prized because they produced more heat and kept people healthier through winter. Warm ale, safer than water and sometimes sweetened or spiced, was sipped throughout the day, warming hands and bellies alike. Fermented foods carried through winter added nourishment and subtle warmth. Meals were often heaviest in the evening, so digestion could generate heat during the coldest hours of the night. Cooking and heating were inseparable. The same fire warming bodies, food, air, and spirit. One fire, one pot, one room. A system simple but resilient. Medieval people lived with little, yet they carried deep knowledge of survival, a confidence born from knowing that even in the coldest season, they could keep themselves alive. And now we have come to the end of our journey through medieval winter. We have walked through houses made of mud and straw. We have sat by fires that never went out. We have felt the weight of wool clothing and the warmth of bodies pressed close in the night. We have eaten from pots that simmered endlessly and drunk hot ale and slept in our clothes while storms raged outside. We have seen how communities banded together, how villagers became survival organisms, how knowledge was passed down through generations in the form of practices that worked even if no one could explain why. But now it is time to return, to come back to this moment, to this room where you are, to this time, with all its comforts and conveniences that medieval peasants could never have imagined, with all its wonders that would seem like magic to them. Take a breath, a slow, deep breath. Feel the air around you. Notice how easy it is to breathe, how the air doesn't hurt going into your lungs, how you're not breathing visible clouds of frozen moisture. Notice the warmth. Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe your room is a little cool and you've thought about adjusting the thermostat. But it's warm. Warm enough. Warm without effort. Think about what you didn't have to do today to achieve this warmth. You didn't have to gather deadwood from a forest. You didn't have to split logs or dig peat. You didn't have to carefully bank a fire and pray it would last the night. You didn't have to huddle with your entire extended family under shared blankets. You didn't have to wear every piece of clothing you owned just to survive until morning. You didn't have to eat the same turnip stew for the 100th day in a row. You turned a dial, or pressed a button, or simply benefited from systems that run automatically, heating your space without you even thinking about it. This is the miracle of modern life. Not that we've eliminated winter. Winter still exists. It's still cold outside. But we've eliminated its power to kill us. We've made it a season we can watch through windows rather than a threat we have to fight every day. You see, this is what I wanted you to understand. Not just the techniques of medieval survival, though those are fascinating in themselves, but the context, the enormous gulf between the ease of our lives and the difficulty of theirs. And in understanding that gulf, perhaps finding something important. Gratitude, yes. Gratitude for heated homes and electric lights and clothing we can simply buy rather than spending months to make. Gratitude for food security and medical care and all the things that medieval people did not have. But also something more, something deeper. A kind of humility, perhaps, or perspective, or connection to the past, an understanding that the comfort we enjoy is not normal in human history. It's exceptional. It's recent. It's fragile. For most of human history, for thousands of years, staying warm through winter required knowledge and labor and community cooperation and sometimes just luck. It required everything a family could give. And still, sometimes, people died. We don't face that anymore, most of us. We're protected by technology and infrastructure and the accumulated wealth of industrial civilization. And that's wonderful. I'm not suggesting we should go back. I'm not advocating for some return to medieval hardship. That would be foolish and cruel. But I am suggesting that we remember, that we don't forget where we came from, that we honor in some way all those people who survived centuries of winters with nothing but mud and straw and wool and each other, who built systems that worked, who passed down knowledge that kept their children alive, who made it through somehow to spring, over and over, generation after generation, so that eventually their distant descendants, people like us, could live in houses that are warm at the touch of a button. We are the beneficiaries of countless innovations, countless discoveries, countless acts of persistence and ingenuity and survival. Every medieval peasant who made it through winter contributed, in their small way, to the long chain of human survival that leads to us. We exist because they survived. We are here because they figured out how to stay warm when warming was hard. And maybe, just maybe, we can take a small piece of that knowledge forward. Not to use exactly as they did, not to abandon modern comfort, but to remember. To remember that warmth can be simple, that community matters, that sometimes the old ways, the slow ways, the ways that seem primitive, contain wisdom we've forgotten in our rush toward convenience. To remember that humans are resilient, that we can survive remarkable hardship when we work together, that the body itself is a resource, generating heat, capable of enduring cold that would seem impossible. That knowledge, practical knowledge of materials and techniques and how the world works, is as valuable as any technology. To remember that gratitude makes life richer, that appreciating what we have rather than taking it for granted brings a kind of happiness that no amount of comfort can provide by itself. That sometimes the best way to enjoy warmth is to remember cold, to remember when it was scarce, to remember what it cost. As you drift towards sleep now, wherever you are, I want you to carry a few final thoughts with you. Let them settle into your mind gently. Let them become part of your dreams if they will. First, you are connected. Connected to all those people across time who sought warmth as you do now, who needed it, who built their lives around achieving it. You are not so different from them, really. Strip away the technology and the centuries, and you're still human, still vulnerable to cold, still dependent on warmth for survival. The difference is just in how that warmth is provided. They worked for it directly. You benefit from systems that work for you. But the need is the same. The fundamental human need for warmth in a cold world. Second, you are fortunate, blessed if you believe in such things, lucky if you don't. To live in this time, in this place, with these protections. Not everyone in the world today has the warmth you have. There are still people in 2026 who struggle to stay warm in winter, who can't afford heating, who live in inadequate housing, who face cold as a daily threat. So your warmth is not universal. It's particular. It's a gift you've received through the accident of when and where you were born. Third, you are capable of more than you know. You have within you the same resilience that medieval peasants had, the same ability to endure hardship, to adapt to difficulty, to survive against odds. You rarely need to access that capability, and thank goodness for that. But it's there, in your genes, in your brain, in the deep structures that make you human. If you had to, if circumstances forced it, you could do hard things. You could learn to survive. Don't forget that. Don't let comfort make you believe you're fragile. You're tougher than you think. Fourth, and perhaps most important, warmth is not just physical. The medieval peasants taught us that. They survived not just because of clever building techniques or wool clothing. They survived because they had each other, because they shared warmth, physical and emotional, because they were embedded in communities that provided belonging and purpose and meaning. You need that too. We all do. You need connection. You need people who care whether you're warm, whether you're safe, whether you make it through the night. You need to be part of something larger than yourself. A family, a community, a group that faces the world together. Modern life makes that harder, makes it easier to be isolated, makes it possible to go days without meaningful human contact. But the need remains. It's built into you, into your biology, into your psychology. Humans are social creatures. We evolved to live in groups, to depend on each other, to share warmth. So nurture your connections. Tend them like you would tend a fire. Feed them with time and attention and care. Don't let them die out, because they're as important to your survival in the long run as any heating system. They're the warmth that technology can't provide. Now, as sleep approaches, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, let me tell you one last story. A small story. A quiet story. The kind of story that's meant to ease you into dreams. Imagine a small house on a winter night long ago. 500 years ago? 600? It doesn't matter exactly when. A house in a village in northern Europe. England, perhaps, or France, or Germany. Somewhere cold. It's night. Deep night. The kind of darkness that no longer exists in most places because of light pollution. But back then, when the sun set and the moon was dark, the darkness was complete, absolute. Inside the house, a family sleeps. Mother, father, 3 children, and the grandmother, old now, her hair white, her movements slow. They sleep on their platform along the wall, pressed together under layers of wool blankets that have been in the family for generations. Patched and mended and patched again. The fire in the centre of the room has been banked for the night, buried under ash. It glows faintly, barely visible. The room is cold. You can see breath in the weak light from the coals. Outside, the temperature has dropped below 0. A hard freeze. The kind of night that kills. But inside, under the blankets, there is warmth. The children sleep peacefully, nestled between the adults. The grandmother, at the edge of the sleeping platform, is kept warm by her daughter on one side and her grandson on the other. She can feel their breathing, their presence, the heat of their bodies. She is old. She has survived perhaps 60 winters, which is remarkable for her time. She has seen much: hunger, disease, death. She has buried children, buried a husband, endured sorrows we can barely imagine. But she has also known joy, has felt the satisfaction of work done well, has known the love of family, has experienced the deep contentment that comes from being needed, from being useful, from being part of something larger than oneself. And now, in the darkness, in the cold, she is at peace. Because she is not alone. Because her family surrounds her. Because the warmth they share is enough. Just enough. She doesn't know how many more winters she'll see. 1, 2, perhaps none. Perhaps spring will come and she will see it, or perhaps she will not. But in this moment, she is warm, she is safe, she is loved, and that is enough. Let that image stay with you as you sleep. That grandmother, surrounded by family, warm in the midst of cold. Let it remind you of what matters. Not wealth, not possessions, but presence, connection, belonging, the simple, profound gift of not being alone. Sleep now, sleep warm, sleep safe, and know that the cold is outside, but cannot reach you here. The fire still burns. It always has, from their time to ours. The same fire, in a sense, passed down through generations. Not literally the same flames, of course, but the same knowledge, the same determination to survive, the same human need for warmth, and the same human ingenuity in achieving it. That fire burns in every heated home, in every warm blanket, in every person who cares for another against the cold. It burns in the systems we've built, the technologies we've developed, the communities we've formed. It's the fire of human resilience, of adaptation, of survival against odds. And it burns in you. The determination to stay warm, to stay alive, to see another day, another spring, another summer. That determination has carried humans through countless winters, through ice ages and little ice ages, through famines and plagues and wars and disasters. We keep going. We survive. We find ways to stay warm. You carry that legacy. You are the latest link in a chain stretching back through time, back through your parents and grandparents, back through countless generations, back to those medieval peasants huddled in their one-room houses, back further still, to ancestors who survived winters before houses existed, before fire was fully mastered, in conditions we can't even imagine. They all made it. Every single one of your direct ancestors survived long enough to have children. That's an unbroken chain of survival stretching back to the beginning of the human species. And beyond that, back through earlier hominids, back through mammals surviving the ice ages, back through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Every organism in your direct line survived long enough to reproduce. You are the product of billions of years of successful survival. That's in you. That resilience, that capability. Don't forget it. But also remember the warmth, the comfort, the gift of living in this time when staying warm is easy, when you don't have to fight for every degree of heat, when winter is beautiful rather than deadly, when you can watch snowfall through a window while sitting in a warm room without fear. This is the best of times in many ways. And understanding how hard things were, how much our ancestors struggled, how much they endured, makes this time even better. Makes the warmth sweeter, makes the comfort more precious, makes you more grateful. And in that gratitude, perhaps you'll find peace. The kind of peace that allows deep sleep, that carries you through the night and into morning, that helps you wake refreshed, ready to face another day. So sleep now, my friend. Let go of the past. Let go of the cold. Come back fully to the present, to your warm bed, to your safe room. Let my voice fade into the background. Let the story dissolve into dreams. Let sleep take you wherever it will. And know this, you are not alone. I am here, at least in voice, accompanying you through these quiet hours. And beyond that, you are connected to all of humanity, past and present. All the people who have sought warmth and found it. All the people who have survived winter and welcomed spring. You are part of that vast, ongoing story. And that story continues, with you in it, into tomorrow and beyond. Good night. Sleep well. Stay warm. And may you always remember, the fire still burns. In you, in all of us. The fire of human warmth, human ingenuity, human survival. It has burned for hundreds of thousands of years, and it will burn still when we are gone. Carried forward by those who come after, just as we carry it forward from those who came before. The fire still burns, and you are its keeper, whether you know it or not. Every time you seek warmth, every time you share warmth with another, every time you survive another night, you feed that ancient fire. You keep it alive for one more day. That is your inheritance. That is your gift. That is what you carry from the past into the future. Now sleep, and let the warmth hold you until morning comes.